Hey, you are listening to Real Talk with me, Ali, and her, Avril, on the post-burnout growth podcast. And today's topic for you is self-compassion, which Avril and I just decided a few moments ago that we had to share with you. So we are delighted to have you here with us. Let's settle in. Hey,
Hey Alison,
Avril.
it's good to be here. It's good to be here as always. Let's get
Good.
talking.
So, self-compassion. What comes to mind for you when you think about self-compassion?
Do you know what? When we were talking about this a few minutes ago, as we do when we're preparing for real talk with Ali and Avril, if I'm perfectly honest with you, if you'd asked me this question a few years ago, I had no clue what it meant. It was one of those sort of words and those terms I'd heard in the sort of self-development world, and I thought, oh, this is a nice thing to have, self-compassion. Um, but if I'm perfectly honest with you, and to respond to your question, that sense of learning to have compassion for self, to offer it deliberately towards oneself, especially in moments of, to use the word crisis, in terms of recovery, in terms of coming through burnout, I think it would take actually being in that place to learn what it would mean to do the work of compassion. um, for most of my life, I had been really good at offering that kindness and empathy, potentially in an unboundaried way to the world and to the relationships and situations and work outside of me. So learning to have self-compassion, learning to turn that powerful force inwards, um, has really been the journeying forwards, I would say. But also learning that compassion isn't um it's not something you do, it's something you have, and it's something one has to learn to embody. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what it's meant to me, what it's kind of the work I have to continue to do. How about yourself? What has self-compassion been for you?
Yeah, it's funny you said as well that you just wouldn't really it kind of almost those two words don't really register. It's like, oh yeah, I've heard those words self-compassion, but I don't really know what they actually are and what it means in reality. And I think it's
Mm,
that thing of there's just so many skills that we need in adulthood that we don't get taught. And I think it's fair to say, as per our examples, we've discovered it as part of the process of recovery as a necessity.
mhm,
But self-compassion is, and I love the words you used about, um, sort of powerfully turning inwards towards yourself with love and that sense of care and attention. And also just recognizing in the moment, whether it's a situation or something, that there's actually a need for it.
mhm,
Before you can perhaps go, oh, I need to offer myself self-compassion. And what might that look like?
mm,
And I think it's one of those, it can sound quite fluffy again. If you've really never, I mean, sometimes in life you don't come across certain until there's a necessity for you to actually come across it. It's almost like,
sure.
necessity is the mother of all invention or something like that, is what I've heard people say. And I think so. So for me, self-compassion and also grace have been, I'm going to use the word excruciatingly difficult to offer myself because that's probably
Mhm,
a true reflection. And over the years, it's become less excruciatingly difficult to offer
mhm,
myself. But I continued through different readings, different authors out there that pioneer in these kind of subject areas about the fact that these are actually really valuable skills to have. Be that empathy, be that compassion, be that offering ourselves grace when, maybe we're just not feeling on par that day. We feel like we didn't give our best. Maybe things just didn't work out as we might have hoped. And instead
mhm,
of berating ourselves, with that lovely inner chatter and inner critic rising up, that we go, actually, do you know what? I did the best I could today. If I get a shot to do it again, I know now I have some more insights, some more ideas of how I could set myself up for success going forwards. But I think self-compassion is one of those things about not just understanding what it is, why you should have it, developing the skill and practicing it, but also just what does it look like in action? And what does that
Mm,
look like in action for you? For me, self-compassion for me is two words, actually. It begins with stop self-pressuring.
hmm
So it's when there's been a situation that's arisen and I perhaps haven't made the progress that I wanted to on something that's really important. I haven't been able to make something come together in the timeline that I perhaps set for myself, and I perhaps feel disappointed. Is, the self pressure that I'll have exerted and said, oh, you didn't do it in time, you need to do it on time. And it's actually going, wait a minute here, you've made some progress today, take a step back, take the pressure off. And actually, by doing so, you're going to be able to come back to this even better.
hmm
Even if that seems counterintuitive. So I think probably one of the biggest things I'm trying to get at in a very long-winded way is actually learning that self-compassion for me is taking a step back. Be that 5 minutes, be that an hour, be that half a day, be it a week, whatever it might require. And what about you? What about self-compassion in action?
That's a really good question. And I loved hearing your response in terms of taking that pressure off.
Mm,
So many of us who have been conditioned to a response of being either, tending towards overachievement or tending toward, the tendency towards workaholism as we kind of push down other levels of discomfort, will kind of recognize that we are putting all of this pressure on ourselves or holding ourselves to standards. I want to say high standards, but maybe we didn't set those high standards for ourselves to begin with. We just took it and run with it. So I really loved your reflection on taking that step back to notice. That resonates with me too. For me, specifically in terms of self-compassion and action, as you were speaking there, what hit home for me was me recognizing the language I'm using in those moments in terms of how do I offer myself kindness? How do I give grace? But what is actually the language that's coming through in my inner chatter, in the dialogue I have for myself? And one of the most practical ways I have learned to offer myself self-compassion, and that came through a long process of being both in trauma therapy, but also working with some fantastic coaches, was to actually pause and notice, do I speak to myself with the same love and grace, in the way that I would offer my closest friends or a coworker who's struggling at work, or a spouse, or, a parent, anyone. And I think the language of love, that language of kindness, just going, would I say this to a friend? And if I wouldn't say this to a friend or a loved one or a stranger, why am I saying this to myself? So I think for me, it really came down to just noticing that and then starting to, um, I've developed certain phrases that I really love. And sometimes it sounds like, Avril, I'm so proud of you for making it through today, or that was really difficult. I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to learn. So, really, sort of sometimes out loud, sometimes in a journal, really stopping to reflect, but really that sense of encouragement, that sense of being my own hype person.
mm,
And I think I want to add that on as sort of that secondary skill, or maybe the complementary skill of um, not just self-compassion as sort of, I think you said these words before, a fluffy thing, but a real thing. Me becoming the person I can count on, me becoming the person I can trust first before anything else. While, I might be in a difficult situation, or I might be experiencing a difficult emotion, or, it's life is thrown everything all at once. So it's really sort of, because we know that kind of when one is in burnout and one is feeling that overwhelm, and when it feels like all of the fires are on all around us and within us, it can be so hard. Even I do recognize now as we are speaking that when we say stop to notice, like it took a long while before I could get to a point where I could go, yep, I'm going to stop and notice. And so I think having those skills for me in practical terms of a language and being my own hype person, being the person I can trust, has really kind of been those building foundational building blocks of self-compassion within myself. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Gosh, you got me thinking about so many things there, actually. One thing that you almost, I don't know if this is a thing or not, but it got me curious about it, which was when you said about how I talk to myself and the words that you use. And I think you might have sort of said something along the lines of love language. And I thought about, the love languages, Dr.
Yes,
John
I do.
Gottman. And I
Yes.
just thought about what love languages do we have with ourselves? When you think about the
Mm,
love languages, I think I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but like ones like acts of service, acts of affection. And then what that had me thinking about was, generally speaking, acts of self love towards ourselves are arguably acts of self compassion. So, acts of self love is, for example, how do you talk to yourself? Um, taking the best care of yourself. What needs do you have in
hmm
that moment? Your need in a moment of distress or crisis might just be a moment of comfort. And how can you give that to yourself? How can you meet your own needs and really give yourself the bestest care possible? Which
mm,
again, I think a lot of people will be like, ooh, that sounds like a bit self-indulgent and a bit like, and this is something that I think we all struggle with. But
yeah.
actually, it is from first-hand experiences, actually the thing that we need to give ourselves most, but we benefit most from
hmm
than what our typical stance is. Oh, I better not do that. I'll be seen as lazy, or I can't slack off. I have to keep pushing ahead here. Okay, well, if it's not working out, I need to do something else. I need to keep going. I need to keep going, kind of thing. Instead of actually, no, I
mm,
actually need to step back. I need to just take a breath, take a beat, stop, think about how can I nourish myself in this moment, back to self-compassion in the moment.
wow.
And when we
Yeah.
give that love to ourselves and we shift our state of perhaps maybe not feeling so great, let's just say we're experiencing some bad feelings, that we shift out of those bad feelings into either a more positive, more helpful feeling, such as calm, or perhaps even we just feel like, oh, that actually felt quite good. I'm a bit
Yeah.
surprised by the fact that I was able to make myself feel good. And that kind of
Mm,
almost gives you a little bit of a, you might want to say a dopamine hit that you go, oh, actually that was way better than I expected, and kind of gives you a little bit of a boost or a spring in your step. I mean, I'm not
yeah.
talking about when you're right in the midst of burnout. I'm talking about post-burnout growth as you're
Yeah.
on that path, as you take these little steps to start, as your sort of earlier words about turning towards yourself with love,
Mm,
whether that's self-compassion, whether that's self-care being, are you having your needs met, whatever those might be. How are
mm.
you talking to yourself? What's your relationship like with yourself? How do you see yourself? Is that helping you? I mean, there's loads of things here to think about. As you can tell, my mind's gone off on a spin now.
No,
So,
you've raised a really great point there, Ali. I loved what you said about the shift. And really, this is what we're hoping to create with some of these conversations that you and I are having in this sort of collective space is about why self-compassion, why are we turning towards ourselves? And I love what you've said there about that shift. When we can come into a place of that inner resourcefulness, whether that might be peace, calm, contentment, joy, whatever the words are that we are using, but we understand within ourselves that we are more adequately resourced to meet the moment, to have ourselves meet the moment, because we understand, and this is more and more coming through from neuroscience based approaches as well, is that when the brain and when the body is in a regulated state, we are more able to confront, to meet, to tackle what's in front of us, and to do that from a place of not coming completely undone when we have had that experience, and to move through that experience and also have then the capacity to learn from it. So, whatever that might be, having a difficult conversation with a manager, setting a boundary with a loved one. So I love the fabulous point you're making there as well about self-compassion as a path towards inner resourcefulness so that we can continue that forward growth, that movement towards, continually becoming
mm,
who we deeply desire to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the other one point I would like to make about self-compassion is we're often so we're so often looking outside of ourselves for that comfort as the
Yeah.
first port of call. And you made a point around resourcefulness, and it does tend to escape us that, yes, whilst we need other people in our lives, that we can be our own leader, that we can be our own resource, and that we actually have the capacity to meet ourselves. It's a
Yeah.
little bit of knowing how, a little bit
Mm,
of trust, and a little bit of willing, a little bit of practice. Um, but most often, when we're seeking either external comfort, be that in the form of food, alcohol, or other substances, or it could be comfort in the form of attention from others. Most often, in my experience with working with clients and also my own journey, actually, it's us that need to give ourselves that loving attention first, back
mm,
to self compassion, self love, self care, etc., etc. And it is arguably, the most potent, I would almost go so far to say is probably one of the most potent energies that we could, um, I'm struggling for the words here, Avril, so you feel free to jump in, but it's kind of like, it's probably one of the most potent, resourceful things that we could possibly do for ourselves, that we could
mm.
access in our lives, that
Yeah.
creates a foundation
Mm.
or everything else. It's kind of the root is what I'm trying to get at.
I
I
love
haven't
that.
probably
I love
I don't
that.
know if I've said that as exactly as how I was trying to say it, but maybe you can
You
make
said it beautifully.
better sense of it.
You have said it beautifully, my friend. I was going to only use the word gift, but you've said it, that is so spot on. I also love that you've kind of brought this conversation as we're closing, brought this conversation back to some of the intentions we have for this podcast, which is, what are the foundations? What are those building blocks and skills that we didn't learn, could have learned, should have learned, all of that? What are those foundations we now have the opportunity to install as we move through burnout and come through to post-burnout growth? Because we want to avoid repeating cycles of burnout. We want to move through this process, through this experience, having explored with curiosity what are the patterns, what are the shaky foundations that potentially led us here. But from this place where we are now, even in the midst of deep burnout, what can we put in place? And I love that you've touched upon the fact that, at the point that self-compassion is one of those foundations. It can be that deep root, that deep well from which we can resource ourselves.
Mm.
So as we start to bring this conversation to a close, thank you everyone for listening to today's conversation on self-compassion on the Post Burnout Growth podcast, Real Talk with my friend Ali and with me, Avril. If what you've listened to today resonated with you, we hope you will continue to stay with us. So hit follow to subscribe or to listen to this podcast and keep coming back. If you know someone who is in a similar place and would be helped by our conversation, we would love for you to share this with them so we can continue to grow this community of people traveling this road to post burnout growth. So that's it for us from today. Thank you for me, Avril.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, we'll see you soon. Bye.